I am Shannon Weigel. I'm the Director of Policy at Edison Energy and also the Policy Committee Chair of the Illinois Solar Energy Association. I will be serving as the moderator today. We're going to be talking about what policy developments to watch in 2019. You'll hear from four energy experts. They're very engaged in policy development here in Illinois. And you'll hear what policy actions will happen in 2019, and then also how those may impact your business. You know, if you're coming from the state or you already are here, policy can really make or break your business here. So what we'll be doing is talking about that. Looks like we've got almost everybody mic'd up, so I'm going to go ahead and lay out the format of the panel and then give a brief introduction. So first we'll have Kevin Borgia give a brief overview of the timelines and venues for policy action in 2019. Then we'll have a discussion on those policy actions and hopefully give a lot of time for you guys to ask questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists today. I just want to add that all of these panelists are longtime participants in the Illinois policy-making process. They were very important players in the development of the Future Energy Jobs Act, and I'm sure they will be very involved in 2019 legislative and regulatory proceedings. So first I want to start with MeLena Hessel. She is the policy advocate at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. If you attend the Solar Coalition calls, Midwest Solar Coalition calls on Wednesdays, you may hear her voice. She gives the Illinois updates there. Next, we have Kevin Borgia, who is the Midwest Policy Director at Cypress Renewables. He's also on the Illinois Solar Energy Association Board and the Policy Committee as well. Next, we have Scott Vogt with ComEd. He is the VP of Energy Acquisition there, and he is probably a familiar face if you've attended any of the ComEd solar forums that they've had throughout this past year. And then finally, we have Barry Matchett, Head of External Affairs for the Midwest and Gulf at Clearway Energy Group, and he's a legislative affairs guru here in Illinois. So I'll go ahead and kick it off to Kevin to give a brief overview of the policy venues and actions that will happen in 2019.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Thanks, Shannon. So just a quick overview of a couple of the timelines for folks that don't live and breathe a lot of these policy and legislative regulatory avenues as we on the panel here do today. So a couple things, legislative avenues and regulatory avenues. On the legislative side in Illinois, we actually have what's called a Veto Session this week. This is a short 2-week session where really not that much gets done in Springfield. Usually comes after the elections. That's this week and the week after next. Not that much generally gets done, but we'll see kind of how that goes. The bigger legislative action that happens in Illinois is in the general session, which in Illinois goes basically from the end of January until the end of May, 31st of May. By state constitution, all bills have to be passed before they require additional approvals. So the heavy action on the legislative front in Illinois really ramps up in March, and you get really March through May, a lot of action during those weeks. On the regulatory side, things are a little bit more ambiguous, not defined. I think a lot of us are very excited to see the adjustable block program moving toward its launch. I think for many of our mental sanity, we hope there will be no more rulemakings. We all have to go through no more comment processes that a lot of us have been through there. And we'll see a program launch on January 15th, as we've been discussing today. The final lottery structure, as Anthony said, should be released at some point in the near future. And then on the comment side, we've seen some work-throughs, some waivers on the interconnection side. Hopefully we'll see no more of those. I think we've had enough scars from those over the past month here. All of us, right? But no, again, I think we've been working together quite well, and we've seen a lot of progress to see this program launch very soon. And so that's kind of the overview of the calendar on where things are going to move forward over the next couple months here, and interested in getting into the issues a little bit more.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So first, I'll kick it off to Kevin. Which policy actions do you believe will draw the most interest from the solar industry in 2019?
Sure. I think we've talked a lot throughout the earlier panels today. There's a lot of interest in this program. There's a lot of industry interest. There's a lot of customer interest. I know that as a company, we're very interested in really the program launching and then beginning to offer this product to customers. On the community solar side, there's definitely a lot of interest, and we're excited to move that forward. So that, I think, is less of a policy interest, is more of a commercial interest. But as far as kind of policy advocacy that the industry is going to pay attention to, Governor-elect Pritzker has talked about expanding the RPS. He's talked about 100% clean energy goal. Again, I think that's kind of an aspirational goal at this point, but that shows the kind of interest that we're talking about. I think the industry should be paying attention very closely to that. And again, making sure that it's my advice, as has been said by other panelists today, make sure you're plugged in on that front with Leslie at ICEA and SIA as well, because it's important that we all speak as one voice whenever we can as an industry. And I think that, again, plugging in with the relevant trades in the state is the best way to really make sure that we're doing that.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin. Barry, since you're also in the industry, would you agree that that's probably the most important policy action in 2019 for the solar industry to watch?
So I think when I think about policy stuff for 2019 and really any year, I think about how the General Assembly thinks about it, because we can easily get into our own bubble. And so I would echo what Kevin has said. Kevin's provided some detail. I just want to pull back for 1 second and provide one bit of context. So, the incoming governor is going to be faced with both expenses and revenue problems. And so on the expense side, he's going to have to deal with pension funding, school funding, K-12 and higher ed, restoration of social service safety net. He wants a $15 minimum wage. He wants to expand Medicaid and Medicare healthcare protections. And he also wants to move forward with the capital bill. These are all significant new expenditures. On the revenue side, he's talked about modifying the existing tax structure, potentially going to a completely different tax structure, a progressive tax structure. Clearly the gaming industry is coming in. Clearly the marijuana, not medical anymore, we already have medical, but just recreational marijuana industry is coming in. And those are perceived as significant new potential revenue streams to fund some of the things on the expense side. Where does energy fit into any of that? I think every person that registered for this conference is focused on building a business in the energy space. And it's mostly, if not completely, policy driven. I think we've also heard a whole bunch of panels talk about some well-intentioned policy that may be not totally functional for the industry as we sit here today. When we approach the General Assembly, they're going to be thinking about all that other stuff that I just mentioned. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that. When I think about the energy set of issues that are going to be presented to the General Assembly this upcoming session, we know that there's going to be pressure on the state to deal with modifications in the capacity markets. There's simply no question about that. There's an enormous amount of work already being done on that. There's a lot of work being done, and I hope Scott can tell us a little more about it, on how the distribution company, whether it's ComEd or Ameren, can modify their relationship by creating a more platform-driven approach to interacting with suppliers and users of energy. And then we're finally down to what solar developers are focused on, which is enhancing the type of programs that already exist to better be able to take into account for the massive demand that we have for our product. On the supply side, I think everybody knows there's a lot of demand, a lot of interest in building, and a lot of customer interest. And I think fundamentally what the legislature is going to be confronted with is how to balance what feel like very acute issues for us with what feel like very acute issues for a lot of people in the General Assembly, for which energy may be a bottom of tier 1, top of tier 2 issue. So Shannon, to your question, going into the 2019 legislative session in this room maybe feels like oh my God, obviously we need to change the adjustable block program to take into account the things I just said. But if you're a state senator or a state rep, you're probably not yet confronting any of the issues that we're dealing with, and I think that we should touch on that as we go forward. And I would leave it to MeLena to bring out the very critical issues around addressing climate change. So I think it's a very challenging session as we go into 2019.
Thanks, Barry. So MeLena, what is the environmental industry going to be focused on in 2019?
So I think as we're thinking about these conversations in the General Assembly, and I think Barry laid it out very well in terms of the General Assembly's perspective and what's top of mind. The environmental community has been thinking about, what comes next. The Future Energy Jobs Act was a really important bill for us to pass in terms of enabling what we have today, all of you in the room wanting to build solar here in Illinois. How do we get beyond that? And the environmental community has come together around 4 pillars that I think a large we, not just ELPC, are interested in pursuing in Illinois. Those pillars are getting to 100% renewable by 2050, and Governor-elect Pritzker has publicly committed to that goal, which we're very excited about. Getting to a carbon-free electricity sector by 2030, replacing 1 million gas and diesel vehicles on the roads, and then making sure that all of this is done with equity, and that the workforce created, particularly when we're thinking about new clean energy opportunities, is an equitable one, includes disadvantaged communities, coal transition communities, folks who maybe have been left out of other energy economies or are going to be suffering as we transition. So, what does that mean back for the folks in this room? I think as the environmental community is having these conversations around 100% renewable and thinking about things like what the workforce is going to look like, it will be relevant, I think, to plug in and ensure that our goals are aligned, that the solar industry's goals and the environmental community's goals are aligned as we're moving forward with potential legislation in 2019.
Great, thanks, MeLena. As Barry alluded to, there's going to be some potential changes with capacity market reform, specifically in PJM. Scott, to you, how will the national and regional capacity market discussions impact the legislative and regulatory environment in Illinois in 2019?
I think it's going to be a focal point in terms of what FERC and PJM decide to do around capacity markets and whether energy efficiency or renewables or any program or any resource that has a state program that supports it is going to qualify for a capacity contract. I think that obviously that has impacts on solar as well as our energy efficiency program, our demand response programs that are out there, and in terms of what the benefits are that can ultimately roll down to customers in terms of energy prices.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to add anything there? Okay. Scott, back to you. The solar industry and ComEd have had a short productive history in working together. How can we continue that momentum into 2019?
You can all just agree to whatever I throw out. Make it a lot easier. I just, only because Kevin.
We have a very positive relationship.
Geez, we worked really well last week together.
We've solved all the problems. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid, frankly, there's one more coming. As we talked last week on the waiver and getting an agreement on the waiver and submitting that to the ICC, hopefully with just one issue to be decided. I'm a little concerned about commercial industrial rooftop, just based on what we've seen in our interconnection queue. And we did agree to, not allow those projects to bubble up, but at the same time, I was meeting with one developer on Friday who was concerned about having to make deposits on projects to keep projects in the queue, to keep their space in the queue, and that deposit is a reflection of a bunch of community solar projects that are sitting in front of it. So, we've got estimates for interconnection that aren't real, that are rippling down through all phases of the market. So I am a little concerned if there's potentially another waiver that has to come as we start to think about this. just over the last couple of weeks, we've crossed over around our interconnection queue in terms of the number of megawatts we've seen around commercial industrial projects, to where we're sitting at that magic 104 megawatt mark, which means 2 blocks potentially are full. We don't know whether all those projects are ultimately going to go for RECs or not, or how they're going to play out, but we may be facing yet a potential second lottery, so we'll see how that plays out over the next few weeks as we see projects come in. So I eat, sleep, and breathe interconnection right now. Whether it's studies, estimates, what's in the queue, what's the process. I think in ComEd, it's not so much, while there is a little bit of a policy aspect of how that gets built, we're starting to face questions about, well, how are they going to get constructed? If you think about it, it's been 2 years. I'll pick on you because you picked on me. So, actually, Veto Session is a very active place to pass legislation. It's significant. Because Fiji passed in Veto Session almost 2 years ago, and it's been 2 years. And while a lot of you, we've seen some development, we've seen megawatts, we've seen growth on the residential and the CNI side on the system, we're still waiting, right, on real steel and iron into the ground on these projects. And that's, from a policy perspective, I think downstate, one of the hardest things. It's like, hey, we need more, yet we haven't even gotten to the point of showing what we've got yet at this point. So there's just a timing aspect of how this is all going to roll out. Solar for all, the rules are just getting out there, and Veto and Elevator working on that. So a lot of the stuff that we contemplated in Fiji, we're almost there. We're almost there to start to where we really see that development. So I'm so focused, and we're so focused right now on implementation of actually getting this passed. It's hard for me to think about that next policy aspect at this point.
And I'll jump in on that. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of legislators that say, where are the jobs? They're still in the future, right? We don't have them yet. And they don't understand. I mean, these programs take a long time to set up, right? I mean, the IPA has a ton of work to do with the long-term plan and all that. You guys have a ton of work to do on the interconnection side. Lawmakers don't necessarily know all that, right? I mean, they think they pass a law and you're going to see jobs in 6 months, and that's not really the case, right? And so I think that from a legislative perspective, there's probably a lot of apprehension about that, and maybe even some questions if the jobs are ever going to come, because 2 years later, they still haven't. So I think that might be a real question on the legislators' side.
That answers sort of Barry's question of where legislators put this policy in their head. That's the answer. It's oh yeah, we passed that 2 years ago, so where are the jobs? That's the extent I think they're thinking about it.
Right. And just to tag on, because it's everybody's seen my map when I throw up the projects, where those projects are in the interconnection queue. And one of the things I'm concerned about in 2019 in the spring session is when we throw up that map about where are the projects, and we have a void in Cook County. And we've got to see some projects in Cook County. We've got to see projects start coming in there in order to ship. There's a significant number of those legislators that are in that Cook County, Chicago area that voted for this bill, and if they don't see manifestation of projects in that area, there's going to be a swing back around it.
On that point, is that something that you think can be addressed, that void in Cook County could be addressed through the 2019 long-term plan? I know the IPA has a lot of discretion to make some changes there, or do you think that would need to be a legislative fix?
So I'll take that first. I don't think we know for sure. There is language in the law about having a diversity of projects across the state. So I think that there's an open question, and I think, your first question to Kevin was what's something that the solar energy industry should focus on when it comes to policy in 2019. Well, one thing that is coming up is the revision of the long-term renewables plan that led to all these programs in the first place. I expect a draft maybe around August in line with the electricity procurement plans. I think that's an open question that will definitely come up. I think that we'll be seeing folks from the advocacy community who are interested in seeing that, bringing it up, even if the industry or the IPA does not. And that's a place we're going to figure that out.
Great, thanks, MeLena. Anyone else want to add?
I think there's a tension here between, in a deregulated state, where clearly the benefits of competition have accrued to the customers, but working under the premise that you're not picking winners and losers. There's that side of this, which is something that in I would say with almost uniform support in particular the business community is seen as good. I think that runs up pretty hard against maybe some of the things that we're starting to delve into here, which is establishing a set of preferences, right? And so I actually think that the legislature, which is, if I were to assign an ideological term to it, probably significantly more progressive than it was before the election. The incoming legislators, I think, are going to be very open to a discussion about allocating ratepayer dollars to essentially pet projects and pet areas. I think the business community, which has a much longer view than most of the legislators, it's important to remember, 25% of the Illinois House wasn't there 2 years ago, okay? That means there's not very much institutional memory, but businesses remember forever. And I think there's a very interesting tension that we haven't seen play out. We actually need it to play out a little bit to see whether or not finding a path for more prescriptive work in the statute or in subsequent rules that satisfy what I think could be considered reasonable requests by legislators. If that has the muster to pass what I would consider business community reactive opposition, right? So I think, again, I don't want to get too far over our skis on that particular issue.
And I'll just add that I don't know where that debate will end. I don't actually know where I even think it should end yet. I don't have a position, but wherever it ends, I think it will be important for everyone involved to be thinking about the long-term future and long-term sustainability of these programs in this market in this state. Because, if you go too far in a direction of pet projects that your implication is potentially aren't as cost effective, that isn't effective either.
In the case of Cook County, there's clearly land.
Yeah.
So there are some other factors there that probably should be run to ground in partnership with the utility. The utilities and the developer need to be working with the county officials to figure out what isn't quite clicking for the developer community to propose projects in that particular county.
Well, and my hope on that is that, you're going to know your key better than anyone here, but that we will see some projects develop in Cook County. Even if it isn't this cycle, the hosting map that you guys have put together should hopefully foster that kind of activity in the future, as people have a little bit better idea of where the opportunities might be on the grid. At least I would like to hope. I think that's an area where the industry and ComEd work together quite well.
Right.
And hopefully that will help to foster that kind of growth in Cook County going forward.
And long term, we will be working on the locational value of distributed generation in this state. That's an important policy issue, I think, for this industry to be aware of, that we have a DG rebate. Right now there's an interim value. We will have a DG rebate at an interim value. But long term, we still have to figure out how to value the locational benefits that DG brings, to figure out what the long-term value of that rebate will be and how that will look in different places. So there are various pieces of policy already to come that we will have to do a lot of work on that can help begin to answer this question as well.
Great, thanks MeLena and everybody else. I just want to add that we're going to be taking questions 10 minutes from the hour, so start formulating some of your questions for this panelist here. One other question about 2019. How do you think that the decline in the federal ITC will impact at the end of 2019 will impact solar development in Illinois. Will there be a rush to get projects constructed? What are your thoughts?
Look at me. I mean, in short, yeah, I think there'll be a rush to get things constructed as soon as you can, for sure.
Scott, do you have any thoughts on how the utility might handle that rush?
Oh, I have thoughts. I think I've been quoted last week, but I'll leave it alone. I gotta come deeper. All right. I think it is to be seen, frankly, in terms of how it all plays together, in terms of the construction timeline. You know, as we move through this year, we're going to run lotteries sometime in this late winter. Looking at Anthony, I don't know, but let's presume it happens sometime in late winter. That's when we're going to get the contract, or not the contracts, the construction schedules from everybody about when they want to be built. And one of the concerns I have is everybody wants to be live on November 30th or December 31st, 2019. And, you know, luckily there's some safe harbors in the ITCs. You can get the ITCs if you only got 5% of the project in or whatever. Maybe you already bought your panels, so you're good. And you don't have to be rushing to try and get everybody built. But that is our concern in terms of how do all these factors play together in terms of when recs have to be delivered, when do projects have to be up and running, when are we taking things out of service on the system. And, you know, I know there's been a lot of conversations about interconnection costs and things like that. And just keep in mind, we haven't built a single community solar project and connected a community solar project at this point. Actually, I have to take that back. There is one project that is up and ready to go, and it's just waiting for a rec contract to go. But other than that, we don't have a whole lot of experience with this, so trying to figure out how all these projects are going to play. Now, we have an awful lot of experience on connecting customers, of connecting load on a regular basis and adding those customers, and that's really where our experience has been on versus connecting power plants. So a lot to be seen and learned from that.
Great, thanks. We'll go ahead and take some questions from the audience. Anybody? Awesome.
Thanks. So this is a question for Scott. You knew it.
I knew it.
I know.
I watched the mic go.
So what do you see is the utility's role in the solar market in the future?
We want to facilitate. Thank you for that one. It's really important for us that I heard the prior conversation, which I thought was a really good one, on consumer protection and what customers are facing out there. Solar's complex. It just is for the customer to understand. Community solar is potentially complex for the customer because there's potentially two bills, one from us and one from the community solar developer, in terms of how does the customer take those two bills and reconcile, hey, did I save, did I not save? So there's a lot of customer experience perspective that we see as an opportunity for the utility to act as a facilitator. So we are deep in the throes of putting together a solar experience for customers, and we'll be rolling out tools and material for customers to educate themselves around the opportunities around solar. We have imaged every rooftop in the service territory to estimate the production levels of every rooftop that customers can put in their address and pull it up and get an estimate of what a solar system would look like for them. Largely not because we're trying to quote the system for them, as much as we're trying to educate them around the factors that go into it. Like, what's a rec contract? What's that mean? What are the incentives out there? What's the ITC? How does that play into your decision making? When we think about community solar, customers in Illinois have experience around alternative suppliers, and we want to help them understand that community solar is very much like an alternative supplier relationship, except you've got a bilateral contract with a physical asset out there, and that's the way to think about it. But a lot of opportunities, we want to facilitate, we want to educate, we want to help customers make the choices they want to make. That's the role that we see for us.
to that is, one, does that require legislation, or do you feel like you can do that on your own? And two is, how do you maintain neutrality amongst the providers that you would be facilitating and the competition that is so good to customers?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I don't think it needs legislation because when we're talking about facilitation, we're talking about education for the most part. There's potentially other opportunities out there that we've been thinking about and exploring, but we haven't gone down that path just yet because we want to get this market moving. We got to see what those opportunities look like, or where's the confusion from the customers. We've started doing consumer research on customers around community solar, and we've gotten some really interesting feedback from customers when we try to explain community solar. So we know that there's a lot of education that has to occur for customers to understand.
Hi, Nick from Newburgh Construction. We're in Urbana, Illinois. That's where the University of Illinois is located, and so I've talked with them about doing, installations, things like that. But there's a lot of not clarity on. They have their own utility grid, and it's probably more for Anthony and them. But like when I talked to Anthony, he said he didn't know a while back. Essentially, how are they going to be treated? Are they a co-op and a muni? Are they, how can they participate as their sort of own grid that technically is kind of owned by the state, sort of on a policy level and some other levels as well? I guess that's far.
So U of I think that's worth having a discussion afterwards on both the policy level and then I think at the technical level. So why don't we just talk afterwards? But I think if the state's got a lot of aspirations on the capital bill, that's where they work on things for higher ed, for the university. And if you live in Illinois, you know that the budget stalemate resulted in a significant reduction in funds available to our directional universities, to U of I, Chicago, Champaign. Everybody's really cut back. And so there's a lot of arms in the General Assembly right now to restore as much of that funding as possible, and to the extent that you're no longer funding a humanities professor because that person has moved to a different university and funds are now available and you're looking at your budget with fresh eyes. Clean energy, I think, is probably very likely and very high priority for most students, and therefore presumably most administrations, particularly if it can be shown to save money. So I think that's worth a more detailed conversation. Happy to talk further.
And as we wait for the mic to get around, I'm going to give you a yes or no question here. There's been a lot of talk about community solar. Yes or no, will companies achieve greater than 50% small subscriber participation? MeLena, I'll start with you and go down the line.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I would say yeah.
Yes.
Okay, there's agreement there. Does everybody in the room agree? Any people disagree? Awesome. Okay, great. Leslie, do you have somebody? Okay, great.
Hey, Derek with Sun and Solar. First off, we we think you guys have done a great job so far. So, you may not hear that too often, but from an installer, we feel like you guys have done a great job with preparation of documents, PDFs, trainings for us and to educate consumers. And from experience, we feel like you guys have done a much better job than other states and other utilities. So, thank you to you guys on that. One thing that would help us from an interconnection perspective is a little bit more visibility on how to interconnect. Ameren's done a great job with that, showing maps and drawings of different ways of interconnection. We've struggled getting answers back from the interconnection side of ComEd on, can we tap into the utility meter, different ways of actually interconnecting. So that would be super helpful for us. To know, having diagrams and things like that for future installers as well that are coming into the state.
Is there a question?
So the next question is...
That was a request.
Yeah, the request, we have a
I
question.
thought I'd take that back a little. So the next question would be, you're talking about 2019, but from a business owner, I'm looking years ahead, right? we don't necessarily, our business isn't from here in Illinois, so we're based out of South Carolina. And for us, when we look at going into a new market, we're looking at long-term sustainability, like you guys have said. And what I see happening with the SREC is just explosive growth. And so, has there been discussions on, when net metering and RPS does get hit, what that next step is going to be with the utility companies, and how are they reacting, and what is their kind of buy-in in for the long-term sustainability of solar going forward for 10 plus years down the road? Because we've seen that as a massive struggle in multiple other states, that when an SREC or a rebate comes out, market explodes, but then net metering is almost hit, and there wasn't a lot of discussions previous to that on how to extend that going forward. And so I'm just curious on what you guys are seeing from that perspective.
Are you talking about net metering in particular, or more broadly?
Yes.
So if I can jump in on this, since this was my pet part of the legislation, we actually, as we were doing the legislation in Fiji, we looked at all the other markets. We looked at Nevada, Arizona, California, and we had extensive conversations in that legislation around and negotiations around what happened. And MeLena touched on it earlier, is that the DG rebate is actually in process right now. And while that was a set price of $250 per kW for community solar and C&I projects as part of the initial legislation, the provision in there was once we get past the 5% cap or threshold where we have 5% of DG assets on our system, then we will, at 3%, we go to the commission to set up a new value stream. And our issue all along was not that there's not value for solar, it was that we felt like the way net metering conveyed that value to customers was arbitrary. So as MeLena talked about, we have put in, the legislation has provision in there that we will determine the locational value of solar at the time that it's being deployed. So we will be sending market signals to different places on the system where solar is going to have the highest value to the system. And that's going to be the next big process once we get past 3%, which is somewhere, I don't know, I peg it right now, 2020, 2021.
Although there is disagreement on what even constitutes 3%, in terms of, we're a complex market with competitive suppliers and the default supply from ComEd and Ameren, and also, we're adding community solar customers for the first time, and those folks will be getting bill credits. How do they count into this net metering cap? There's not agreement on that point. So, one of the questions you didn't ask, Shannon, but you sent around to us is what something regulators are going to focus on in 2019. And I think this is a really important question for regulators to answer. And in terms of the future of the value proposition of solar for customers, this is particularly important for residential customers because those are the customers, for the most part, and some small commercial customers, that are relying on full retail rate net metering, and residential customers aren't able to even choose to get this rebate in the event we hit these 3% and 5% thresholds before we're ready to do for the DG rebate to come out. Looks like we need to wrap up, but I will say there's a lot of work that has to go into that. So this is a really important issue, both the timing of when we hit that, and also the work that's going to need to go into figuring it out. We put a lot of work into resolving just a very few number of issues with this interim rebate that is almost.
So I'll take some rebuttal in the last 30 seconds and say the interconnection queue is chock full of projects for C&I and community solar without full retail net metering. So in my view, this whole conversation about whether full retail net metering is necessary when you have a higher SREC for community solar with 75% small customers plus a $250 per kW rebate, economics look pretty good. It's a question of whether, if you had a similar structure with a rebate and a value for residential, do you really need full retail net metering to make it work versus just having a rebate convey the value on the front end in conjunction with a 15-year SREC contract paid up front.
Scott, right now the residential customers can't access that rebate until we finish this proceeding. So that's part of what I'm saying.
So this debate could go
Yes.
on for a long time. We are actually at the hour.
This is good stuff.
Yeah, hopefully it can continue on into the other room. And if you guys are here for Solar Power Midwest, I hope you can reach out to our panelists who will be around as well. I want you to join me in thanking our panelists, MeLena, Kevin, and Barry, for a wealth of knowledge. And as you can tell, 2019 is going to have a lot of policy discussions and debates that happen, so please tune in through ISDA, engage there. We want you to be involved. Thank you so much.